Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Imperator Mar'gok on Mythic difficulty in Highmaul.
Yes, we're finally at the last boss, and what a good last boss it is. It's a really long one though. Good 15-minute long encounter, a brand new bonus phase at the end. It's really fucking awesome.
Now before we go into any details about this fight, if you don't know anything about this boss on heroic mode, do click up on the annotation you see on your screen now. It'll take you straight to that video. You can learn everything there, come back, and then you can start learning about the boss on Mythic. Now for this encounter you do want to bring 2 tanks, 5 healers and a mixture of ranged and melee DPS. However, certain classes are amazing at this fight because quite a lot of the fight, especially the first 3 phases, is all about dealing with the Arcane Wrath because it's become far more of a burden to deal with. Mages are great at it, hunters are also really good, and monks are absolutely amazing if you're using the tactic that we use.
Now, just as a note that this fight has so many different strategies, each with their own pros and cons, but really we're just going to go into mainly covering the strat that we use to kill the boss, because you could go out there and find a million different things to deal with all of these little things, but this worked for us, so we're going to share what we did.
Now, the fight consists of 3 main phases, which is down from 4, in which you need to deal with Mar'gok with an intermission phase between each phase. And at the end, you'll have the 1 extra phase where Cho'Gao comes in. So you could argue it's a 4-phase fight, again, like it was in Heroic, with 2 intermission phases. But while Mar'gok is up, there is only 3 phases.
Now, each of these 3 Mar'gok phases have actually no new mechanics in comparison to the standard modes. It's rather that each of the phases is a combination of 2 phases of the standard modes. So each of his 5 abilities that he has 2 additional effects and changes to them, rather than just 1. So, for an example, Phase 1 of Mythic is a combination of the mechanics and augmentations the abilities gets from both Phase 2 and Phase 4 of the standard modes. So you can kind of see already, shit's about to get very difficult. However, the one thing that doesn't change throughout the fight, and we might as well talk about it now, is the Accelerated Assault, which is stacking attack speed on the boss when he's on that single target. You still just need to switch whenever you can. It's absolutely fine. Exact same as you did on Heroic.
Now, because of all the main abilities from Heroic now have 2 effects on them rather than just 1 effect, we're going to go through each phase by phase and talk exactly how you need to deal with them.
Now, in Phase 1, the boss has mechanics of both Phase 2 and Phase 4 of the standard mode. So this means that the Arcane Aberration, which is the ad, not only does it knock you back when it dies, it also spawns little ads afterwards. The Force Nova pushes you back as you go through it and also causes you to do AoE damage around you. The Mark of Chaos teleports you to a random ranged player, and when you explode, you send out a shit ton of orbs, and the Arcane Wrath places a circle around you so you can't leave it, and also it splits into 2 on the first jump. And the mines slowly grow to twice their size over a period of time, and they also split into 2 mines when they're either activated or they time out.
So with all those abilities in mind, this is what we do to counter Phase 1 so we can get him into the first intermission. We tank the boss right in the middle of the room, with the range group stacked up in one location just in front of the throne. We use Bloodlust on the pool, and we don't use it again until the last phase. However, this is entirely up to you. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get towards the end of the encounter. As soon as the first mine spawns on ranged, we then split into 2 groups and then start moving around in different directions as new mines spawn.
Now, splitting the range group allows you to pass through the Force Nova, which is causing all the little AoE around you, without having to move as much. If you had like 15 players all on top of each other, you'd have to spread out a shit ton and you'll need to be blinking and all that kind of stuff. When you're split into 2 different groups, it's much easier to pass through it because there's less of you there.
And as a melee, just make sure you're spread out as much as you possibly can when the Force Nova does come in, and just get back to the boss as soon as you can without taking any damage. Now, whenever the tank gets Mark of Chaos, they'll be teleported to one of the 2 range groups, and then they need to run away 35 yards from that range group. When the tank does explode, range, you need to make sure you know exactly where the tank is, because of course you're just about to have a load of orbs flying towards you, and these orbs in Mythic, if you're not topped off, will one-hit you. Now, either the tank can take the mark, that's absolutely fine, but a tank with like a movement ability, so a movement speed increase ability such as Displacer or Heroic Leap, anything like that, they're the best tank to take it. Now, each time the ad spawns, pretty much as we stressed it in Heroic mode, it's even more fucking important now, even in Phase 1, that it just dies as soon as you possibly can. It's the #1 priority for DPS all the time. Now, when the big ad does actually die, you will be knocked back, so of course ranged players make sure you're not near mines, that's why you always move away from them, just so you never get knocked back into them. And of course tanks, now there's going to be loads of little ones up. These little ones of course won't knock you back, but they do a huge amount of damage, and especially when the Mark of Chaos comes in, you're going to have 1 tank with all the ads and the boss. This is a good time to use a personal cooldown or ask for an external cooldown like a sack or an iron bark, anything like that, because they do hurt. And again, all DPS, you want to be AoEing these down so they die as soon as you possibly can.
Now the Arcane Wrath in this phase is actually pretty easy to deal with, even though you might think, oh my god, there's so many things on it. It's fine, there's pretty much nothing you need to do with it. Now whenever the Arcane Wrath does initially spawn, you just allow it to jump in between that group of players. So if it's at ranged or one of the range camps, it'll just jump between that range camp, or even if it's in melee, just let it jump around in melee. Now as soon as it gets to stack number 5, which will be it can jump up to 12 yards, what you want to do is have the 2 players with the debuff just move to the edge of their circle, while the rest of the players can pretty much stand in the middle of their circle. As soon as it does run out, it won't actually jump to the players in the middle of the circle, even though they're like, what, 9 yards away? For some reason, it's just like, I can't fuck to go that far. So just go to the back of your circle. If people, as long as they're not too close to you, it won't jump and you'll be absolutely fine. One thing to note as well is that the 2 people with the debuff, they can be standing right on top of each other, because of course, Arcane Wrath can't jump to another target who literally just had Arcane Wrath, so you'll be fine stacking on top of each other.
One thing to note is that you do need to be careful if an ad does die at the same time that a Wrath is about to end, because if you do have the Wrath, you don't get affected by the knockback. It almost roots you to the ground. You can still move around, but you're stuck to the ground. Whereas every other player is going to be knocked back, which means they could be knocked back into you, which means they could get the Wrath off you. If that is the case, it doesn't matter. You can just keep going at 6. Just don't make sure the Wrath goes too high. And on 6 or 7, that's when you need to start using personal cooldowns or have your disc use shields. Now, you want to continue doing this phase until the boss hits 66%. And that's when the first intermission will start.
Now the intermission phases in this fight remain relatively unchanged from the standard version of the fight. You still have the little small volatile anomalies that spawn by the boss and they will explode when they die. Of course they do a bit more damage because it's mythic, but they just still explode when they die. These ads should just be picked up by a single tank and kept alive throughout the intermission, and we'll come to that in a little bit.
Now more importantly, you still have the 2 war mages that spawn by the entrance of the room. They still cast their slow, which needs to be dispelled on your DPS or whoever gets it. One thing to note with these is that you can actually use Hand of Freedom. We actually have our Paladin completely solo dispel this phase, because that just removes the debuff. And of course, they would still fixate a player and they will cast their Nether Blast into them. However, one change to this Nether Blast mechanic is that every time they successfully cast this ability, it'll increase the amount of damage they deal by 25%, and this will stack. So if this is left unattended and there's no interrupts to go out to prevent them from casting this ability, the stack will go so high that they'll end up just one-shotting someone. So to counter it and actually allow the stack to drop, you need to assign 3 interrupts, one to go out after another. This will cause the mages to have a big enough downtime between their casts to cause the stack to drop. Really, you want the melee to do the interrupts as much as you possibly can, as their interrupt is generally more reliable and just on a lower CD than a ranged class.
So the key to this phase is assigning 3 interrupts per mage and killing them as soon as possible. As long as their stacks are kept low, there really isn't too much healing to do, because the Nether Blast by itself, when it isn't on high stacks, doesn't hurt too much. Now DPS, you should try and make your CDs aligned with each intermission phase, as getting these ads down as quick as you possibly can is the key of getting a good transition into the next phase, which is pretty much all this fight's about. It's about doing very good transitions in between phases.
So what you want to do with the mages is as soon as they get to 4 stacks or so, start your interrupt rotations and then the stack will drop, kill them off, and then you'll need to move on to the volatile anomalies that are on a single tank. You want your entire raid to stack up underneath them, and then pop every single raid damage reduction you have and just blow up the ads. Because the mages just do so much more damage, it's not a good idea to kill off these volatile anomalies as the fight is going on. It also doesn't really give time for your healers to regen their mana, whereas by doing it this way, you have loads of time because there's like no damage going out in this phase. And all it requires you to do is just stack up and pop every CD. So what we do is that people will use their personal cooldowns, we'll use an Aura Mastery, a Barrier, a Spirit Link, a Healing Tide Totem, and a Tranquility.
Yeah.
All of those CDs in one single go.
It's pretty funny to see the health bars bounce up and down, but yeah, it's the best way of dealing with them, because once again, you can just get so much mana back, and it just helps you prepare once again going into the next phase. All about going into the next phase nice and cleanly.
Now, once you have managed to do that, and of course, kill the ads during the cooldowns, not before or afterwards, otherwise you will die, you will move into phase 2. Now, phase 2 has the mechanics from both phase 2 and phase 3 of the standard mode of this encounter. So this means that the Arcane Aberration, the ad that spawns, when it dies, it will still knock you back, but it has 75% more health, which means it's going to be up longer, which means there's more damage going out on the raid for a longer period of time. The Force Nova will push you back like it did in phase 1, however 2 extra Force Novas will spawn each time it comes in, so you'll have 3 of them. but it won't do the AoE damage around you, so you can remain stacked in this phase. Now when the Mark of Chaos comes in, it will teleport you to a random range player, and you are rooted in place, well, this causes the entire raid to move every time this Mark of Chaos does come in. The Arcane Wrath will still place a circle underneath you, so you cannot move too far, and the jump distance is reduced by 25% each time, rather than 50% each time, so you cannot just move to the back of the circle in 5 stacks as the range group, because it's not far enough. You need to be much further. The mines will grow bigger like they did in phase 1, and they'll now just last longer than they did before, but that isn't really a big deal. The mines are just a joke really in this phase.
So for this phase, the boss is tanked in the middle of the room, and the range restacks back at the throne where you started the entire encounter. Now the range group will be moving around the circle as a single group in either direction. We go left, but you can go whatever, it doesn't make a difference at all. Now each single time a mine spawns, you move to the left and plus a little bit, because of course the mine will be growing, so leave it a little bit of space. You don't need to go crazy, but just move out of the mine, and each time a Force Nova comes in, you'll be running through it as it is pushing you back. You can't just stand there, you do need to run through this.
Now the tank will be teleported to you when the Mark of Chaos is applied. Every time this does come in, the entire raid group just needs to move in one direction, 35 yards, just so you don't take any damage from it. Melee also might need to be careful when this does come in, because potentially when the tank is teleported to that group, that could be within 35 yards of melee, so just keep that in mind. Now when the ad spawns, it is once again #1 priority for DPS, and it's even more so important in this phase because it has increased HP, which means it's going to be around longer, dealing more damage to your raid, and if you combo that with the extra Force Novas, it really isn't that nice. There's a lot of damage going out, so kill it as soon as you possibly can, and of course be careful when it dies because you will be knocked back. Don't get knocked back into the mines, and don't be knocked back into the Mark of Chaos. That's pretty bad as well.
I've done that a couple of times. Yeah. It's awful.
Now the Arcane Wrath in this phase is significantly more awkward to deal with, because not only are you restricted by the circle around you, but of course the jump distance is reduced by 25% rather than 50%, which means you need to either be really far away from the raid, or you need to make the stack go up a lot higher. Making the stack go up super high is not a good idea. People start getting one hit. It's just not realistic. You won't pull it off every single time.
So the idea is that you really want to drop the Wrath on the lowest possible stack, while still being safe in the knowledge that it won't jump to another player. So what we do is that we have one hunter, or any really range with a big constant damage reduction cooldown, who's also quite good at doing damage on the move, and one very mobile healer to deal with this Wrath. The reason you want a healer to do this with the other player is because you're going to be out of range of the healers while you are taking this Wrath all the way over to bloody China or whatever. So you do need to make sure that you are topped up, because of course it's still doing damage even on the lower stacks, so it's much safer to do it with a healer. So you'll jump this debuff between the two players while taking it as far away from the group as you can until it hits around 6 stacks. At this point, the other person, which is normally the healer, will need to try and get 45 yards away from that person in 3 or 4 seconds. And this is why we said you need a mobile healer. Druids with Displacer Beasts are really, really awesome. Of course, you can also use monks with their roll. That would work absolutely fine. As long as they can get 45 yards away within about 3 or 4 seconds, you should be absolutely fine. Now, the person who is left behind, they'll just pop a defensive CD such as Deterrence or Ice Block or whatever you decide to use to send that person out with, as long as they use a big cooldown and immune the damage.
One thing to note, whoever is taking the 5th stack, you also really want to use a DR as well, because it does do quite a lot of damage. If you don't use anything at all, it'll probably knock you down to about 20% health. And there are moments in this fight where the Wrath is on you and you're about to take the 5th stack, and there's an add up which is doing AoE damage to you at the same time. So using some sort of personal cooldown is really good, which again makes Druids even better, because you can use Bark Skin and Iron Bark for almost every single one on yourself, which means you take very little damage from it.
Now, the key to dealing with the Wrath in this phase properly is picking it up off the initial target as soon as possible, because it can be really awkward picking it up off of anyone during some of the mechanics, such as Force Nova and all that kind of stuff. When knockbacks are happening, it's generally really awkward. So what we do, we actually have set locations that either the melee or the range will move to when they get the Wrath, making it easier for that initial target, so either the hunter or the mage, to go and pick it up.
Now, as you want a hunter or mage to be the person that's left behind, as they have the highest damage reduction in comparison to the healers, you want to make sure that they pick up the debuff on the correct stack. The hunter or the mage wants to be the player who has the 6th stack, so they need to be the person that picks the debuff off the initial target, so they would have the 2nd stack. If this doesn't happen, you may need to bounce it between other players, just to make sure that the hunter or the mage is on even stacks rather than odd stacks. However, don't take too long to do this. It's not super important, it's just the safest way of doing it. If you faff around for too long and don't gain enough distance away from the raid, you've completely fucked the Wrath, and that could potentially cause a wipe. Now you should only have to deal with the Wrath really in this phase 4 times. If your DPS is really low, you may have to do it 5 times.
Now because of this, you do actually need to assign 2 different people to do with the Wrath with the healer. So the healer's always the same each time, but normally you don't have enough cooldowns to do it one after another after another. So what we do 2 hunters. One hunter deals with the first 2 arcane Wraths, and then the other hunter deals with the 3rd and the 4th, and that's just the way we do it. But if you somehow find a way of making it so you can cool down every single one, then go ahead. But generally you want 2 people to be assigned to do it with the healer.
Now the boss will transition into the next intermission phase once he hits 33%. And when going into this intermission, try and make it so there isn't an ad up, or the ad that is up is just about to die. If this means that your DPS need to slow down just to get into the intermission cleanly, then do so. You don't want to go into this intermission with a full health ad, it fucks things up. Now in this intermission, it's exactly the same as the first one, apart from you now have to also deal with the Reaver. Now on the standard difficulties, it's very likely, especially if you followed our heroic guide, that you'd nuke the Reaver down as soon as possible and just ignore the ads at the back. However, on Mythic, due to the mages having this stacking buff, you can't really ignore them. You need to go over and kill the mages first, which means the Reaver's going to be up the entire phase. So you do the exact same strat as you did in the first intermission, in terms of a DPS at least. You need to just make sure that you keep rolling your 3 interrupts on each war mages, just to make sure their stacks don't go above 4 or 5, while one of the tanks picks up the little lads, and the other tank needs to pick up the Reaver. And once again, DPS, try and have your CDs up for this intermission. You probably want to be using your second pot in this intermission just to get these war mages down as quick as you possibly can. Now the tank that is taking the Reaver, he needs to make sure of course he's facing it away from the raid because of the shockwave, and because no one is going to be doing any damage to this until the war mages are dead, this means your stacks are going to go incredibly high. You want to start chaining CDs like after the second stack or so, and you need to be ready to get kicked in the face. As soon as you do get kicked in the face, of course you're going to lose all threat, and then the Reaver is then going to go on the second target that has the highest threat. You want to try and make it so this is your other tank, which means you're now going to have the other tank without any stacks, thankfully, because he hasn't tanked him just yet, but he's going to have all the little lads as well. This is a good time to use CDs again. If you need externals, then use externals. We usually give him a sack and an iron bark at this point, and then we bitch heal that person until the other tank that was initially tanking the Reaver comes back and taunts him again. And you just repeat this process until you get towards the end of the phase. But do note the tank that is tanking the Reaver will just get higher and higher and higher stacks, and it becomes a little bit scary, but you want to keep it that way. You want that tank to take all the stacks and one of the tanks to take none, because of what happens in the next phase, and you'll understand when we talk about it in just a moment.
So once again, once the war mages are down, you do want to stack up and pop all of your defensive CDs all over again and blow up the little lads. At this point, the Reaver should also be into this little clump. Make sure it is facing away, because a shockwave at this point is completely KO.
Yeah, you're dead.
Yeah, it's so bad. So either way, make sure he is facing away, and you can kind of cleave off of him. If you are like a pure cleave class, then just make sure that he is your primary target while you are cleaving off of him, because this is the time where you're going to start taking down the Reaver.
Now once the little lads are dead, you now want to finish off the Reaver, but ranged you want to start moving away from the boss. And we'll talk about this in a second. First, let's talk about these stacks that are on the tank. The Reaver is still going to be up, and you now have the boss up. You want the boss to be on the tank that doesn't have any stacks. And the tank that is tanking the Reaver, you're going to be getting absolutely battered by the Reaver at this point. Again, just try and keep your cooldowns up as long as you possibly can and kill off this Reaver. But note, you are going to have to taunt the boss at some point with stacks, because you need to reset the boss's stacks. When you do this, you need to communicate with the other tank and say, I'm about to taunt, and the other tank needs to almost taunt immediately back as soon as you've reset the boss's stacks, because you're just about to take a huge amount of damage, because you're going to have 6 or even 7 stacks from the Reaver. Once you've cleanly made that transition, you'll be now in phase 3.
Now phase 3 is arguably the most challenging phase in terms of both healing and personal responsibility, because really you're not all clumped up and you can follow the leader anymore. It's time to play properly.
Now phase 3 has the mechanics from both phase 3 and 4 of the standard mode, which means that the ad that spawns, it's going to have 75% more health, and it will also spawn a bunch of little lads when it dies. The Force Nova, it will now come in a pulse of 3, and it will also make it that when you go for it, you'll do AoE damage to anyone within 4 yards of you. This is horrible.
Yeah, it's
by
really,
the way.
really
This
bad.
is fucking horrible. The Mark of Chaos, it will root you in place, and when you explode, you'll send out orbs. This is pretty fucking horrible. The Arcane Wrath, the jump distance is reduced by 25% each time rather than 50%, and it will split into 2. This is fucking horrible. And the mines, they'll last for 2 minutes instead of 1, and they'll keep splitting into more mines. this is fucking horrible.
Basically, this phase is really fucking horrible. However, you can get through it as long as you follow this strat. Now, the boss will be tanked in the center of the room, and the ranged DPS and all the healers, they'll be spread out in kind of an arc shape around one side of the room, leaving the other side of the room completely clear, and this is very important for the Arcane Wrath, which we'll talk about in a bit. Another reason that the ranged DPS are spread out, of course, is to counteract this Force Nova, as it is doing AoE around you, and it does spawn 3 times. If you were all clumped up, you'd have to do a hell of a lot of movement in order to remain close to each other, and of course spreading out, going in and spreading out. It would generally be completely terrible, so you'd just be spread out in this arc, making it so you can just stand still while not dealing excess damage to anyone else around you. And of course it will increase your own personal DPS for most people, because you can just stand there and nuke the boss.
Now, melee have a lot of movement to do in this phase, especially because of this Nova. Each time this Nova comes in, you need to run out or use some sort of immunity or jump over it in a certain way. If you stay stacked, even if you're taking damage with only one other player, it can be catastrophic and you can die so easily. So melee in this phase, you just need to make sure that you are never on top of the tanks and that you do move out when the Force Nova comes in, and you will need to do this almost every single Force Nova. Pretty much one Force Nova comes in, you run back to the boss, do one ability, then run out again.
Yeah.
Go back in, hit one ability, move out again, and you have to do that for every single Force Nova. It is horrible, but unfortunately, melee, you have to do it.
Now the ad, once again, even though we're saying it's #1 priority for DPS, it is like mega #1 priority for DPS. If you were just subtly cleaving it, I guess you could have got away with it. Now you can't. Everyone nukes this ad because you're having so many Force Novas coming out and they're doing AoE ticking damage around you, and it's horrible. This ad needs to die. If this ad is up during a Force Nova, it can just flat out cause wipes if you haven't got the healing for it. So kill the fucking ad. It's really bad. Of course, when the ad does die, it gets all of the little ads. This will be picked up by the tank who is tanking Mar'gok at that point, and then you'll have your Force Novas come in. So once again, these little lads are #1 priority DPS. They have to die as well. Using things like stuns when Force Novas come in on these lads do work, and also it reduce the amount of damage the tank takes at that one point, because you can pretty much get one shot if you fuck it up.
Yeah, tanks want to be using DRs as well here, because it's just nasty. If there's an ad up and the boss is on you, and the boss has relatively high stacks because the other tank is dealing with the Mark of Chaos, you need to stun these ads or use some sort of damage reduction. It's horrible. We have had wipes where it's happened before. Just make sure that you do that. Now, placing the mines in this phase is completely key to keeping your melee happy. As the mines last a lot longer and they split, if you have a mine that spawns anywhere near melee, they are going to have less room to deal with certain mechanics such as Force Nova. So if you stay at max range of the boss as a DPS or as a healer, you will reduce the chance of a mine splitting and start moving towards melee. Remember that the mines do not grow during this phase, so standing right next to a mine in order to try and spawn another one right on top of it, just to free up space, is an excellent idea. Just be safe when you do it. You should be fine.
Now the Mark of Chaos in this phase is quite awkward to deal with. What you need to do is have a tank taunt the boss just before the Mark of Chaos is cast, and that tank will be just outside the group. Once the boss starts casting this ability, you have the tank jump away or blink, or you know what all tanks can do, roll, anything that you've got just to get the fuck out of the way, because you want to go 35 yards away from melee, so melee don't need to move. They already need to move enough, bless them, let alone having to move from fucking Mark of Chaos as well. So if you can get 35 yards away, absolutely brilliant.
And of course, tanks, once the cast is finished on you, you will be rooted. If you are within 35 yards of the boss, shout out to melee just so they know to move away from you. When you detonate, the orbs will send out. Everyone now needs to be completely responsible for themselves to move out of it. And of course, this can happen at the same time as a Nova, so you need to be very careful of the orbs and the Nova at the same time. Basically, don't avoid an orb just to stand on someone else.
Now this once again leaves us with the Arcane Wrath, which is really fucking awkward to deal with all the other mechanics going on. Now as the range are so spread out and there are 2 Arcane Wraths jumping about, dealing with this Arcane Wrath with range DPS can be very, very difficult. It'll be hard making sure the Wrath goes to the correct place, on the correct stack, and while avoiding all the mines and the orbs coming out, it'll be pretty difficult. You could probably do it, but good luck. It's going to be very, very difficult to do. However, if you do throw this Wrath into melee, they can deal with it in a much more consistent way.
If you have a monk, that you can use Flying Serpent Kick, druids can use Blink, warriors can use Leap, and you can run super far away with a debuff when it's on 5, 6 or even 7 stacks. And they'll be far enough out of the raid to actually drop the Wrath and no one else will have it. So we bounce it around in melee until it gets to around 5 or 6 stacks and then get one of those players to run away and deposit it. The best people by far to do this are almost certainly monks, because not only can they move further than a druid or a warrior, but they also have a personal damage reduction they can use every single time, making it super safe. Druids are probably second best at it. Warriors, however, are poor at it because they have no personal cooldowns and it requires your healers to give external cooldowns such as Iron Bark or Sax. And it's also very important that Disc Priest, you time your shield so when the player is about to run away with it, that you do have a shield on them beforehand. As soon as they've ran away, they deposit and then come back and rejoin melee and keep going. Now keep in mind you do need 2 people to deal with this Wrath, you can't just have 1 because there is 2 Wraths bouncing around, and there are a couple of things you need to know about Wrath. The Wrath will never jump to the tank that is affected by Mark of Chaos, so you only need to worry about being 35 yards away from him. You don't need to be any further than that, that's absolutely fine. And it cannot jump to another player that already has Arcane Wrath.
So if both the players happen to run out at the exact same time, so if both your monks decide, okay, let's time to deposit the Wrath, if they both go out at the same time and they're right on top of each other, it will actually drop, it won't just bounce between them, because they both have Arcane Wrath at the exact same time.
And of course, when you do have the Arcane Wrath, you need to make sure that you're running away from the raid, not towards the raid. And because all the raid is stacked on one side, you use the complete opposite side, and then that way, it will never bounce to anyone. Now, just to cover the healing briefly in this phase, because everyone is so far spread out, this is definitely the most healing intensive phase, and pretty much every single time a new ad spawns, we try and use some CD just to top people up. Now because you just blew all your CDs right at the very start of the phase, just going in through the intermission, you're not going to have a lot up. So we'd have to rely on using smaller healing cooldowns such as Tree Form or Heart of the Wild, things like that. Basically anything that isn't a large healing cooldown, and then towards the end of the phase those large healing cooldowns would come back. I can't tell you exactly what to use on what ad because it depends on your composition, but ultimately try and have something up for each ad. However, your DPS is high enough on these ads, you don't actually need to use a CD on each ad. It just makes it a lot cleaner, and it minimises the amount of panic healing you have to do on individual people in the raid. Now once the boss hits 5% health, you'll then transition into the last phase. However, keep in mind that the boss will actually be active for like the next 5 to 10 seconds and still do abilities.
And this can lead to some really horrible situations. The worst ones of these probably being getting a brand new Wrath. It will completely screw you over, as you need to spend a fair amount of time and effort just dealing with it, rather than dealing with the actual mechanics of the transition. If you do need to slow down your DPS in order to get a cleaner transition, then do it. It is so worth getting a cleaner transition rather than just, oh, let's quickly get the boss down and get into phase 4. You're going to fuck yourself over if you get too many horrible mechanics.
Now when the boss does actually hit his 5% health and the transition is properly started, there's no need to no longer attack him. He'll start doing his RP with Cho'Gao and then he'll eventually die. And it's at this point a load of new ads will start to spawn and flood the room. Now these ads that come in have absolutely no abilities at all, however when they die they leave a pool on the ground. If you stand inside these pools, you take a ridiculous amount of ticking damage. Basically, melee, when these explode, don't go anywhere near them. And one thing to note about these pools is that they last for the entire fight. Now because of the pools, these ads need to die stacked up because otherwise you're going to run out of room. Now because of the nature of which they spawn in, they seem to spawn in like 2 different locations on either side of the room, and it's super difficult for the tanks to pick them up. And also it's very likely when they do spawn that healers are going to have healing aggro from just general healing. So to counter this, as soon as they do spawn in, if you have MDs or tricks available, make sure that it goes onto the tanks, and make sure you use Hand of Protection on the healers. During this like short time that you see the first set of ads, Cho'Gao won't be active and he won't be able to be attacked, he's just still doing his RP shit. Group up the ads, AoE them down all in one single location, we do it slightly near the throne, and then get ready for phase 4. Now throughout phase 4 you will continue to get these ads to spawn in sort of waves every 30 seconds, and you deal with them the same way, you just make sure you pick them up and kill them stacked.
However, you do have a choice on how you really want to deal with these ads. Either you can nuke them all down every 2 waves that come in, so one wave comes in, you kind of sit on it and you nuke the boss, and then when the second wave comes in, you group them all up and nuke them all down. This will increase the amount of damage that you do to the boss, which is really nice. You want to get through his phase as soon as possible. However, the tank is going to be taking a shit ton of damage, which means healing resources are going to be away from where they need to be and going on the tank. So it's kind of up to you whether or not you want to kill them every single wave they come in or every other wave that they come in. We decided just to kill them every single wave because we have very good cleave DPS in our comp, as well as we wanted to get the healing to the right targets rather than having to kind of waste it in a way on the tank that was tanking the ads.
Regardless of whatever you choose though, make sure that you do kill the ads right underneath the boss so the melee DPS can kill them again, melee move away when they're about to die, and then just move the boss every single time a pool has spawned. Okay, so moving on to the mechanics that the boss actually does, and the first we're going to talk about is Glimpse of Madness. Now every 30 seconds or so, the boss will spawn a shadowy figure on top of a random player's location. Now this figure, you cannot actually target it and you cannot do any damage to it. All this figure will do is just apply a stacking debuff to the nearest target every 6 seconds. Now each time this debuff is applied, it will deal high magic damage and it will increase per application of the debuff. So that player needs to be kept up, otherwise they'll die. Now because the damage gets higher and higher, the player actually taking the debuff needs to move away so they are no longer the nearest target of the debuff, or eventually they'll just get one shot. When the debuff expires, however, it will also deal magic damage to the player, but also to anyone within 8 yards of that player. And the higher your stack is, the more damage you will take from it. So to deal with this mechanic, you need to set up 2 players per glimpse and rotate who is closest to it, and you need to switch on roughly 4 stacks. Now when it does actually expire, you want to use a personal cooldown, however don't use immunities or anything like that because you'll have to use them at another point in a moment.
Now the players you actually want to have assigned to the Glimpse of Madness are really 2 ranged players. Melee DPS, you're really going to struggle because you need to be near the boss as well as it's just a mess. So do 2 ranged players for this, and you want it to be 1 healer and 1 DPS ideally. Now you shouldn't have to deal with more than 5 glimpses in the last phase, so you can really organise 5 groups of 2 players and number what glimpse they have to deal with. So you set up, so the first glimpse is taken by X and Y and blah 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 blah. Just make sure you set it out before you even pull the boss. Now because the glimpse can spawn on a random player, it can spawn in melee, and if this is the case, make sure that the players that you have assigned to that particular glimpse are quick at reacting to it. If the glimpse does happen to spawn in melee, just make sure you do move the boss about 10 or 15 yards away, just so you have a little bit more space, so then melee don't accidentally get stacks. If melee do accidentally get a stack because either the people weren't quick enough or any other reason they do get a stack, just make sure you move out before your debuff is about to time out, otherwise they'll explode on the melee group and it'll be fucking horrible. So if you get the debuff accidentally, make sure that when it does end and it will detonate, that you're away from anyone else. You can also see who is actually getting fixated by the glimpse, because you do get a debuff saying you are fixated by the glimpse, so just make sure, keep an eye on that if you are a little bit worried about it. Now another ability that the boss does is Enveloping Night. Every minute or so, Cho'Gao will cast this, and it is a very long cast that deals large magic damage to all players in the raid, and each cast of this will do more and more damage. Now all damage reductions do work on this, as well as immunities, so as the fight goes on, you would want to use these on the later ones. Now you would normally usually have about 2 of these casts, but potentially on your first kill, if your DPS isn't really up to scratch and a couple of people die, you may have to deal with 3. An important thing to know is that this cast can easily finish at the exact same time that a glimpse target is taking damage from either the stack expiring or a new stack being applied. This is when you want to use your immunities or massive damage reductions as a glimpse soaking player, because 2 of these things combo together will finish you off. So make sure you're using your debts, your ice blocks, anything that you can just to stay alive. And if you haven't really got any of those things and it's kind of shit hitting the fan, ask for an external if there's any going about.
Now one thing to help you with the Enveloping Night is an ability called Infinite Darkness. When the boss casts this, he'll put a debuff on 3 random players, and this debuff lasts permanently or until it's dispelled. All the debuff does is just act as a stacking power word shield. As you heal these targets, their health pool will no longer go up, but instead you'll be stacking a massive healing absorb on them. So it's pretty much like Malkarok from Siege of Orgrimmar, except it doesn't have a cap. However, the healing absorb aspect of this debuff does not become active until the debuff is removed, so when you dispel it. And then all the healing that was on that target is now spread across every raid member as a shield that lasts for 10 seconds. So the idea is that when you do get this debuff, you're healed up as much as you possibly can, and then you dispel it just before the Enveloping Night comes in, which will then put the massive shield across everyone and just completely counters the damage. Now because the healing you deal to these targets only affects their shield capacity and not their health pool, if a target is soaking a glimpse and they have this debuff, they are going to die because you cannot heal them, you have to dispel them first. However, luckily enough, because there is 3 debuffs, you can just dispel those targets and hopefully they're not all glimpse soakers. It's very unlikely that would be the case. What we actually usually do is that when the debuffs initially go out, the healers communicate to each other and decide which 2 targets just to flat out dispel, leaving one of the debuffs up and then just spam healing that guy. And as soon as the enveloping starts to cast, we then dispel that target, shield goes out on everyone, we all survive. Now, one thing to note is, of course, as the fight goes on, the more enveloping knights that come out, the more damage they start to deal, so it's even more important that the later targets, you give them the biggest shield possible. And to help on top of the shields, of course, with the enveloping knights, using things like Aura Mastery on the second one is a good idea. If you do have 3, then you probably want to save the Aura Mastery for that one, but ultimately you should only get 2, as Alex said previously.
Now, the last mechanic the boss will do is something called Dark Star. Now, this is an ability the boss casts about every minute or so, and this will spawn an orb on a location of a random ranged player. The orb lasts for about 7 seconds, and once it times out, it will deal a huge amount of magic damage to anyone within 20 yards. So when the orb spawns, make sure you move 20 yards away from it.
Now, this can be tricky to do when you're trying to soak a glimpse and an orb spawns nearby. You just need to make sure that you move far enough from the Dark Star while still being the nearest player to that particular glimpse. Otherwise, glimpse stacks are going to go all over the place, or you're going to die to the Dark Star. Both are fucking horrible situations. Don't let that happen. However, a stray glimpse going off is a lot better than you dying to the Dark Star, so if a stray one does go out, make sure that that player is aware that they have it and that they don't explode on top of the raid with their stacks.
Another important note about the Dark Star is because it only does spawn on ranged DPS, it is very important that ranged are at least 20 yards away from the boss. It does very much help out because that means that melee don't need to move. If you happen to just be like 10 yards away from the boss, you pretty much make all the tanks, all the melee, all the little lads, you have to all move around and it's bloody horrible. So if you are a ranged DPS or a healer on this fight, do try and stay at least 20 yards away from the boss just because of this mechanic.
So they're all the mechanics for Cho'Gao. There's nothing more and there's nothing less. In terms of positioning with the boss in this phase, you just want all the range to be stacked in the middle very, very loosely, just so glimpses spawn in decent positions. If a glimpse does spawn, move further away from it, so hopefully the next glimpse spawns on you and you're not super close to other glimpses. You don't want them to spawn on top of each other. It makes it very, very awkward. And then you just want to kite the boss in a circle around the range, leaving puddles as you go. Now, we said right at the start of the guide when to use Bloodlust. You don't have to use it in this phase, but if you use it in this phase, it's so much easier. Because even though this phase is kind of easy, especially if you understand the mechanics completely and your players are very reliable at dealing with them, it's just a lot easier to get this phase over as soon as possible. Because it's such a long fight. You've got all the way here. You might as well just blow it up as soon as you possibly can.
The thing is, that's the main problem with Phase 4. Phase 4 is an easy phase. It's not difficult necessarily to deal with. It's just that it's taking you, what, like 10, maybe 12 minutes to get here? So if you go into it and you're probably going to be shitting yourself, like, I really don't want to fuck up, I really don't want to fuck up, you're going to fuck up. So if you can Bloodlust and try and get through it as quickly as possible, of course, it does help out, and it can help you beat that third Enveloping Knight, which is pretty much a one-shot for most people, unless you can immune it in some way. So, yeah, Bloodlusting during this phase can work. If not, you can use it towards the end of Phase 3, but would recommend it for this phase.
And really, that's everything you need to know for this fight.
It's so much stuff going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to go on. I mean, it's definitely a fight that you progress phase by phase. And it does become very repetitive, especially when you're progressing Phase 4. Phase 1 and 2 can be so boring. 3 will pretty much always keep you on the toes. Arguably, Phase 3 is probably the most difficult phase in this entire fight, especially from a healing perspective and definitely for melee. Because you have to, I mean, if you fuck up on a Nova, you can kill yourself or the tank. If you fuck up on the Wrath, you're going to kill yourself.
Exactly. But the thing is most guilds that do manage to get into Phase 4 consistently, you can normally get it down between, like, what, 10 to maybe 20 pulls sort of thing. Yeah. So really, if you can beat Phase 3, you've kind of beaten the encounter, but it's a fucking really, really good one. I'm glad they ended Highmaul on this, and I can't wait to see what Black Hand does on Mythic. It has to be as epic.
Well, thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide did help you out, then please do drop us a like. It helps us out a lot. But if you'd like to know even more about this fight, a step-by-step video showing you exactly what we do at what point, it's going to be a new series that me and Alex are going to start.
Well, we're going to try it out.
With some of the more difficult bosses. There will be a link in the comments or the description of the video once we've made it. So watch out for that one. And of course, if you want to see more Highmaul Mythic guides, which you probably don't because you've just killed the last boss, hopefully, using this guide. They're on the annotations on the screen now.
So thank you very much for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.